Originality is often praised in our society. We want to be original, we want to do things differently, we want to be different, almost for difference's sake. And however, when it comes to things like culture, being original is a good feature, but it needs to be treated with caution, with care. You don't want to be original for originality's sake. When it comes to culture, most of the problems that you're trying to solve in your company have probably been solved somewhere else. Probably somewhere else that's very similar to you. It might be slightly different, but it's very similar. So trying to be completely different, trying to reinvent the wheel for every single cultural problem that you encounter is just not a great idea from a practical standpoint. That being said, there's a danger around on the other side as well. What you don't want to do is cargo culting. So let me explain what I mean by cargo culting while I wait to cross the road. Cargo culting is when you take an idea or a practice or some kind of thing that you've seen done somewhere else and you just copy it wholesale into a different environment without really understanding why it works and what makes it tick. That's a very dangerous thing to do, especially with culture, because it starts to seem fake. It starts to seem like just a superficial enhancement that isn't actually fully integrated into the culture. So, for example, you might see that such and such company has a practice of having one-to-one meetings. For example, Grantree does that. And you might say, okay, we'll just have lots of one-to-one meetings, but then you don't really understand why they're there and what the purpose is for these one-to-one meetings. And you just apply them, and well, that's not going to work very well, because people will feel like, okay, why are we having these one-to-one meetings? Oh, it's just the boss decided to do that. Why should I bother to care about this? So it's important when you copy things to fully understand where they're coming from, but at the same time, it's important not to let yourself think that you can't copy things. It's an interesting balance to try and keep. So one of the more interesting sources of copying ideas that I found recently, well, for me, basically the sources that work the best tend to be books. I appreciate that not everybody learns best from books, but there are a number of people who work very well from books. So here's a reading list of books for people who want to learn more about open cultures, who want to read from authors who have done it before and who have shared their experiences and what worked and what didn't work. Great places to learn things that you can copy once you've understood them and how they were put together and why they were put together. The first one I would say is the Semco books. So Ricardo Semler's books. So that's Maverick and the 7-day weekend, or the 7-day weekend. I will link to all those books in the body of the post, of course, if you look on danieltenner.com. The second set that I'd recommend is, I think you should read Delivering Happiness by Tony Hsieh. That's definitely worth a read. And after that, at that point you're probably ready to go straight into Reinventing Organizations by Frederic Laloux, a book that I've recommended many times on this blog, and which I've bought about 20 copies of by now and give them away to people and got people in my company to read and so on. So actually let me explain why they're worth reading. Semco's book, the Semco books are not very well written, but they're very inspirational, and they're written really from the trenches by Ricardo Semler, who's not a particularly good writer, but he does have a lot of interesting stories to tell, and he tells it how it happened and tells stories of other people and how it affected them. It's really interesting and really inspirational to read those. Then Tony Hsieh is an interesting, very different, much more startup-y angle to that, but it shows you it's a book written by somebody who really, really cares about culture and who learned to really care about culture, who didn't realize he cared about culture in his first business, made all the mistakes, and then did it again properly in Zappos. Reinventing Organizations is interesting because, first of all, it lays out some kind of framework that can be used to talk about open cultures, which is useful in and of itself, but is not the goal. So you shouldn't get fooled by the fact that, okay, you've read the framework, now you've got the value out of this book. The really interesting part is that it looks at a dozen open organizations of all kinds of sizes and extracts common best practices from them. That is a gold mine for copying stuff, because it also explains why they work and how to make them happen, how to implement them, how not to implement them. It's a fantastic book for getting ideas to steal. Then after that, I would say after reading Reinventing Organizations, I would read Dennis Back, The Joy at Work. This one is interesting because it's also a CEO first-hand account of one of the case studies in Reinventing Organizations. So from that point of view, it's really worth reading, and it's also full of it's basically an in-depth first-person view of one of the organizations covered in Reinventing Organizations. So it gives you a better depth of view inside. And that's where my reading list stops for today. That should keep you busy for a good month or two. See you tomorrow.